Okay, let's unpack this. Think about feelings, joy, sadness, excitement, calm. They're just fundamental to being human. But what happens when those feelings get consistently, profoundly out of sync? Or maybe overwhelming or even absent, when they start to become, debilitating?
That's precisely the territory we're stepping into in this deep dive. We're focusing on affective disorders conditions where the core issue really lies in disordered feelings or emotions. And our source material today is pretty interesting, a set of excerpts and figures taken straight from a textbook chapter on the topic.
Right. And our mission here is to really, dig into this material. We want to pull out the key descriptions of these disorders, right, see what the science in these sources suggest about potential genetic factors, explore the biological treatments they talk about, and then really zero in on those specific biological elements highlighted, like certain brain areas, neurochemistry, even things like neurogenesis and sleep cycles. What are the absolute must-know insights this material gives us about the science behind these really complex conditions?
Well, first off, the term affect, that's the technical word for feelings or emotions. So affective disorders are centered on mood. This makes them distinct from something like schizophrenia, which is primarily seen as a disorder of thought, though it's worth noting the sources do mention they can sometimes happen together.
Okay, and the material seems to focus on two main types. First up is major depressive disorder, or MDD. We're talking about persistent sadness, a real loss of interest or pleasure in almost everything, plus other symptoms lasting at least 2 weeks.
Yeah, and the numbers the sources cite are, they're pretty striking. Around 5% of men and 9% of women in the U.S., apparently. Makes it a leading cause of disability.
It really does. And the other major condition covered is bipolar disorder. Here you see these dramatic swings alternating between periods of depression, kind of like MDD, and then these episodes of mania, or sometimes hypomania, which is a bit milder.
Mania, how do the sources describe that? Well, they describe it as a distinct period of abnormally elevated or expansive or sometimes even irritable mood. Someone in a manic phase might feel grandiose, need much less sleep, have racing thoughts, maybe get really involved in lots of goal-directed activities. An interesting detail the sources point out is that the depressive episodes in bipolar disorder tend to be, on average, shorter than those in MDD.
And the material is quite upfront about the seriousness of these conditions. A really sobering point is the significant suicide risk.
Yeah, they provide some stark statistics on that.
They mentioned that people with MDD who'd attempted suicide before had 28.8 times higher risk of trying again compared to those with MDD, but no history of attempts.
That's right. And for bipolar disorder, they cite a 31.1% prevalence of suicide attempts among people with the disorder. It's
significant. Yeah. Clearly not conditions to be taken lightly. So, okay, that paints a picture of what these disorders are based on the sources. Now, what about the why? Where does this material point first when it looks at causes?
Well, the sources bring up genetics pretty early on. And this is where I think it gets really thought-provoking. The evidence presented points quite strongly towards a heritable tendency.
A heritable tendency?
Yeah.
Meaning it runs in families.
Exactly. And the classic twin studies they reference are really key here. The finding, they cite a 69% concordance rate for affective disorders in monozygotic or identical twins. Compared to only 13% for dizygotic or fraternal twins, that's a powerful piece of data.
Wow, 69 versus 13%. That's a huge difference.
It really is. What that massive gap suggests is that while genes clearly aren't the only factor, that predisposition is remarkably strong. It definitely indicates a significant genetic influence.
That really drives home the genetic component, doesn't it? Do the sources mention any specific genes being looked at?
Yes, they do point to some intriguing areas. They mention genes like RORC, for instance, and also others that are involved in controlling our circadian rhythms, our internal body clocks. It reinforces this idea that it's probably not one single depression gene or bipolar gene, but more likely multiple genetic factors that contribute to a sort of vulnerability or predisposition. They set the stage, you could say.
Okay, that makes sense. So, if the sources present these conditions as having these significant biological roots, what about treatments, biological treatments specifically? What does the material cover there?
Right. The textbook chapter goes into several approaches. Starting with medications, there are the major classes of antidepressants most people might have heard of. You've got monoamine oxidase inhibitors, MAOIs, then tricyclic antidepressants, and the more widely used ones now, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, and also the serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, or SNRIs.
Okay, and how do they generally work? The sources explain the mechanism, right? something that neurotransmitters.
Yes, exactly. The material, and they reference figure 17.44 here, explains that their main action is generally to boost the levels of certain neurotransmitters in the synapse, the gap between nerve cells. We're talking about monoamines like serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. These drugs work either by blocking the reuptake pumps, the little vacuums that normally suck these chemicals back up into the sending cell. That's how SSRIs, SNRIs, and tricyclics work. Or they work by inhibiting the enzyme that normally breaks these neurotransmitters down. That's the MAOIs.
So essentially keeping more of those signaling molecules active in the synapse for longer?
Precisely. But the sources also touch on some newer pharmacological developments. They mention brexanolone, which is approved specifically for postpartum depression, and the notable thing there is its rapid effect. Figure 17.15 is highlighted to show effectiveness sometimes within just 60 hours.
That is fast. And what about ketamine? That's been getting a lot of attention.
Yes, ketamine is discussed too. The sources note its rapid antidepressant effects, especially in treatment-resistant cases, people who haven't responded well to other medications. Figure 17.16 is used to graphically show just how quickly a response can sometimes happen, potentially within minutes or hours.
Wow.
And the text also points out its potential benefit in reducing suicidal ideation, which is obviously very important.
Yeah, absolutely. But treatments often come with downsides.
Critically important point. The sources do emphasize that while these medications can be very effective for many people, they can also come with significant side effects. That's always a factor.
Okay. What about bipolar disorder specifically? Is there a different medication focus there?
Yes, for bipolar disorder, lithium is presented as a real cornerstone treatment in these sources. They note its effectiveness in managing the manic episodes, and importantly, also in helping prevent recurrence of both mania and depression. But they stress that it doesn't suppress normal feelings, which is key. It's not about flattening effect completely.
But there are challenges with lithium, right? I remember reading about that.
Definitely. A major issue discussed is its low therapeutic index. That means the dose that's effective is quite close to a dose that can be toxic, so it requires really careful monitoring of blood levels. And side effects are mentioned too, things like thirst, increased urination, weight gain, hand tremors. Those can be issues for people taking it.
Right. Okay, so beyond medications, what other biological therapies do the sources cover?
Well, they discuss electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. It's got a, controversial history for some people, but the sources highlight its continued effectiveness, especially for severe depression in cases that haven't responded to other treatments. They note its rapid results.
Rapid results sound good.
They are, but the sources also point out that relapse can be common if it's not followed up with other treatment, like medication or maintenance ECT. The text briefly mentions it works by altering brain activity patterns.
Interesting. What else?
Then there's vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS. Figure 17.17 actually shows this. It involves implanting a device, a bit like a pacemaker, that sends electrical pulses to the vagus nerve in the neck. The sources state it can help alleviate depression, but it often takes quite a while, maybe months, to see the effects.
So not as rapid as ECT or ketamine?
No, seems slower acting based on this material. Then there's transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. This involves using magnetic pulses, delivered non-invasively through the scalp, to stimulate specific brain areas. It's noted as also being effective for depression.
Non-invasive sounds appealing. And one more, DBS.
Yes, deep brain stimulation, or DBS. This is described as still being an experimental approach, mainly for the most severe treatment-resistant cases. It's more invasive, involves surgically implanting electrodes deep within specific brain regions. The area often targeted, as shown in figure 17.18, is that subgenual anterior cingulate cortex we might talk more about.
Okay, wow. So quite a range of biological interventions discussed. Let's pivot now and dive deeper into the underlying biology the sources explore. The brain itself, the chemistry, our internal clocks.
Yeah, this is where the sources really try to connect the dots biologically. And they strongly point towards the frontal cortex playing a key role, specifically a region within it called the subgenual anterior cingulate cortex, the subgenual ACC for short.
Subgenual ACC. Okay, what's significant about it?
What really stands out from the source material is this finding that hyperactivity, too much activity in this small brain area, seems to be consistently linked with depression.
Hyperactivity there is linked to feeling depressed.
That seems to be the correlation the sources highlight, and what's really fascinating, and figure 17.1 helps illustrate this, is that successful treatment using various different methods, whether it's antidepressant drugs, ECT, TMS, VNS, or even that experimental DBS targeting the area, is often associated with a decrease in activity in that very same subgenual ACC.
So quieting down that specific spot seems linked to improvement.
It really points to that region being potentially quite central to the mechanisms of depression and maybe recovery, according to these sources.
Interesting. So it's not just about general brain chemistry, but specific regions seem particularly involved. But speaking of chemistry, the sources do revisit that classic idea, the monoamine hypothesis.
Right. That's the sort of foundational idea in psychopharmacology that depression might stem from insufficient activity of those monoaminergic neurons, the ones using serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine.
The ones the drugs target.
Exactly. The sources mention some historical evidence supporting this, like the observation that an old blood pressure drug called reserpine, which depletes monoamines, could sometimes induce depressive symptoms, and also studies where researchers experimentally deplete tryptophan, which the body needs to make serotonin. Doing that can affect mood, especially in people with a history of depression.
So the monoamine idea is still relevant.
It's presented as a key hypothesis, definitely part of the story the sources tell. But they also imply it's probably not the complete explanation. The picture seems more complex.
Okay. But then the sources link this chemistry to something else, the interplay between our genes and our life experiences. And this, referencing figure 17.20, seems like a really crucial point.
Absolutely. This is a really, really insightful piece of the puzzle presented here. It's about the interaction between a specific gene, the serotonin transporter gene, and stressful life events.
The serotonin transporter that's involved in clearing serotonin from the synapse, right? Like the SSRI's target.
Precisely. And this gene comes in different versions, or alleles. The sources focus on a short version and a long version. And the key finding they present, which that figure 17.20 illustrates really vividly, is that individuals who inherit one or two copies of the short allele appear to be significantly more vulnerable to developing depression, specifically when they encounter stressful life experiences, compared to people who have two copies of the long allele.
Wow. So your genetic makeup for this one transporter can influence how strongly stress impacts your risk for depression.
That's exactly what the source material suggests. It's a powerful example of how a genetic predisposition doesn't necessarily determine your fate, but it can interact strongly with environmental factors like stress.
Yeah.
That figure really shows the diverging paths based on genetics plus stress level.
That really makes you think. It's not just nature or nurture, but how they interact. What other biological factors do the sources bring up?
They also discuss neurogenesis. That's the birth of new neurons.
New brain cells. I thought we didn't make many new ones after a certain age.
Well, it happens in specific areas, particularly the hippocampus, a region really important for learning, memory, and also involved in mood regulation. And the sources link chronic stress and depression to reduced neurogenesis in the hippocampus, fewer new neurons being born.
Okay. And how does that tie into treatment?
Importantly, they point out that many antidepressant treatments, including medications and ECT, and even things like regular physical exercise, seem to promote neurogenesis. They boost the creation of these new neurons. Figure 17.21 is mentioned in relation to exercise and neurogenesis. So the suggestion is that maybe restoring or enhancing neurogenesis could be part of how these treatments work.
Huh. So helping the brain repair or replenish itself in key areas might be part of recovery. Fascinating.
It is. And finally, there's a factor that's hugely relatable and gets significant attention in the sources. The very strong connection between affective disorders, especially depression, and our circadian rhythms and sleep.
Right. Sleep problems are almost a defining feature for many people with depression, aren't they?
Exactly. Sleep disturbances are listed as a hallmark symptom. And the sources present some really interesting, maybe even counterintuitive findings here. For instance, they mention that total sleep deprivation, just staying awake all night, can actually lead to a temporary but sometimes dramatic improvement in mood for some depressed individuals. Figure 17.24 illustrates this effect.
Staying awake makes you feel better. That seems backwards.
It does, doesn't it? But the data suggests it happens. And drilling down further, it seems that specifically depriving someone of REM sleep, the dream stage, or sometimes depriving them of deep, slow wave sleep, can also have an antidepressant effect. Figure 17.23 relates to this. It's complex, but clearly indicates sleep regulation is deeply intertwined with mood.
And the most obvious example of this link in the sources must be seasonal affective disorder, SAD.
Absolutely. SAD is presented as a clear case study. It's an affective disorder directly tied to the changing seasons, particularly the reduction in daylight hours in fall and winter. It's fundamentally linked to light exposure affecting circadian rhythms.
Which brings us to the treatment for SAD.
Right, phototherapy or light therapy. The sources discuss how timed exposure to bright light can be an effective treatment for SAD, and they link its mechanism back to biology, suggesting it influences those monoaminergic neurons we talked about. Figure 17.25 is relevant here, and helps to reset or normalize the body's cycles of melatonin secretion. Figure 17.26 shows this. It's a direct intervention targeting a biological rhythm to improve mood.
Okay, so let's try and pull all these threads together based on what these sources have laid out for us. We've gone from genetic predispositions, like that serotonin transporter gene interacting with stress, to specific brain areas like the hyperactive subgenual ACC, to the role of neurochemistry, the monoamines, the potential impact on the birth of new neurons, neurogenesis, and this really undeniable strong link to our body clocks, our circadian rhythms, and sleep patterns.
Yeah, I think what these sources vividly demonstrate is just how multifaceted these conditions are. It's really clear there isn't one single cause that explains everything, nor is there a single magic bullet treatment that works for everyone. Understanding these diverse biological factors, the genetics, the brain circuits, the chemistry, the rhythms, it helps make sense of why the symptoms can vary so much between people, and also why different individuals might respond very differently to the various treatments we discussed.
And for you, the listener, hopefully diving into this material helps demystify these conditions somewhat. It underscores that they have a real, tangible basis in brain function and biology areas that researchers are actively investigating. And, as presented in these sources, it also highlights how things we can influence, like sleep hygiene and managing stress, are important considerations alongside medical interventions because they tie into these complex biological systems.
Definitely. We've really extracted some powerful insights from these textbook excerpts today. They reveal this incredible interconnectedness, genes, brain circuits, neurotransmitters, neurogenesis, even our daily rhythms, all shaping our emotional well-being. And despite the clear progress and understanding and treatment that these sources detail, this very complexity leaves us with a really compelling question, I think. Given how many biological systems are involved and how intricately they seem to interact, what are the most promising frontiers for future research? Where might new treatments come from that could offer even more targeted, maybe more personalized, and ultimately more profoundly effective help for people living with affective disorders?